So, welcome to this edition of Innovative Conversations. I'm Patrick Kanary. I'm your host. These conversations are brought to you by the Center for Innovative Practices and the Child and Adolescent Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, located at the Begun Center at Case Western Reserve University. We are also supported with resources from the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. Today's conversation is focusing on juvenile justice. And interestingly, as Matt reminded me, Matt is our producer, uh, our very first podcast of, I'm going to say maybe 5 years ago, was on juvenile justice. It was a roundtable that we had with a variety of experts. And so this feels like a really good, not necessarily bookend, because the story continues, but I think we'll pick up where we are, which is in a different place than where we were 5 years ago. So helping to guide us through this conversation is our distinguished expert, Leah Winsberg. And you'll see Leah's bio on this page. But I'm going to ask her to say just a little bit about her current role, her transition to a new role, and then we will jump into the topic at hand. So Leah, welcome. I'm so glad you could spend time with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me for the conversation. I'm
Sure.
excited to have a dive deeper.
Mhm.
I am an attorney based in Cleveland, Ohio, and I've been advocating for youth and young people kind of in a variety of settings for my entire career. But most recently worked as the senior policy attorney for a nonprofit organization called the Children's Law Center, which advocates for young people both in Kentucky and Ohio. And while leading some of the statewide work on youth justice on behalf of young people throughout Ohio, focused pretty heavily on Cuyahoga County, but still taking a broader lens on the statewide view. And I have recently transitioned. I'm going to be actually returning to the Cuyahoga County Public Defender's Office. I used to work as a public defender in their juvenile division prior to my time at Children's Law Center. And I'll be rejoining their team in a new role called the Community Engagement Attorney. So while that will still be somewhat flexible as we carve out what that role will look like, will include, continuing to work on reforms, but really building meaningful relationships and access with the community served through the Public Defender's Office. So really building better relationships and access with folks who are eligible for indigent defense.
Right. We are really lucky to have you as a resource in the state and certainly now at the lens on our county and city work. So glad you're with us, glad you're not going anywhere else, and you continue to contribute to the advocacy and the work going on here. So our listeners may cover the gamut from we know a little bit about juvenile justice to we know a lot about juvenile justice. So we always try to find a middle ground. But could you give us just a brief history of the emergence of juvenile justice as its own category, if you will, of service? And then we
Sure.
can move on from there.
Yeah. So the juvenile justice system was created as a separate, entirely separate system from the adult criminal legal system, because there was this founded understanding that kids are fundamentally different from adults. They're not just mini adults. So the juvenile justice system was created with this intention to operate, to think through is the best interest of the young person who's in front of the court system, and really to encourage rehabilitation based on the needs of that individual child. So the system itself relied at its founding really heavily on experts and professionals. So mental health professionals and folks who had some significant expertise in child development and appropriate treatment. And so, for about the first, maybe 50, 60 years of having juvenile courts in our country, it was really kind of an informal process. So the norm was to, think through the individual child in front of the jurist and relied heavily on input and involvement from the professionals that would be working with a child completing interventions. So there's always been this, really explicit understanding that kids are different, number one, and number two, that they need really targeted and individualized support for their rehabilitation, and that, they're capable of making change, and that their trajectory looks different than adults in a system. So one of the other kind of major principles of the juvenile justice system was really to prevent kids from the destructive punishment of an adult criminal court system. And because this juvenile justice system was founded on the focus of rehabilitation and treatment, there wasn't at the beginning of that system formal protections that you would see that attached to adults in criminal proceedings. So, for example, the right to a jury trial or the right to even attorneys in the way that it exists now, those weren't crafted for children originally. There was a bit of a different, more informal process in the juvenile justice system at its founding.
Yeah, and it does sound more like historically, I'll venture to say, a social service intervention as opposed to, or not necessarily opposed to, but linked to legal. But like you said, with a heavy emphasis on rehabilitation, the belief that things can change.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we know with all of our systems, whether it's child protection, mental health, addiction services, that over time things change. There are trends, there are loops, there are forwards, there are sideways. I'm wondering if you could give us an example or two, or just reflect a little bit on, let's take maybe the last 5 or 10 years. What kind of trends have we seen contemporarily? And then maybe bring that home to kind of where we are now, where the system, and I know we're talking broadly, but where the system is kind of landed today. So kind of its journey to here.
So I think it's important to maybe take one step back and
Okay.
just note that while there was, this heavy focus on rehabilitation and a more informal system for youth at the founding of the juvenile justice system, there, as you mentioned, there was a time where we made a pretty major shift. And in the 1960s, the United States Supreme Court, really recognized that the way that our juvenile justice system was operating was really, to quote them in Kent versus United States, it was offering the worst of both worlds, because we weren't providing the legal protections that adults who were subjected to criminal, proceedings had, but we weren't also at the same time providing the genuine efforts at rehabilitation that we promised you. So we were seeing this trend away from the informal, focus on rehabilitation, and a shift towards more punitive approaches in juvenile courts, and children were being exposed to more harsh punishments. And so at that point, there was a pretty distinct period where juvenile courts then began to provide more formal protections for youth that looked more similar to how an adult system functioned. So in 1967, the United States Supreme Court held that children in juvenile court proceedings now have a federal constitutional right to due process. So they now have the right to an attorney, the right to notice, to confront witnesses against them, and to be free from self-incrimination. So these procedural protections started to apply to youth, but at the same time, they were also facing increased and more harsh penalties that looked much more similar to how we would treat adults. And so where we've kind of seen, we've seen kind of an emergence of policies that still exist today, that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, that we can maybe talk more in depth about later in this conversation. But we've had time to now look at a lot of research and evidence and understand more about how young people and their brains develop, and how behavior change works and what works for youth, and including those youth who engage in really harmful offending behaviors. And so what we've seen is some trends that really kind of embrace some of what we know works and deviates from what we had been doing for a number of years, which is
Mhm.
really applying harsher responses and penalties to youth in a way that looks very similar to the adult court system.
Yeah.
And instead, the trend is becoming more of, how do we prevent further involvement of this particular child? So
Right.
how do we kind of keep them out, from going further and further into a system and really provide them what they need on the front end?
Yeah. I mean, one of the words that we, excuse me, hear a lot in the world of juvenile justice is diversion.
Mm-hmm.
And the intent of that is literally to keep kids from even knocking on the front door of the juvenile court. But also, once they do cross that threshold, opportunities to really divert uh, practice, policy that, like you said, is more supportive. I do remember from the adult system a number of years ago, probably post 10, when we went through our phase of what was called right on crime.
Mm.
And it was led by a fairly conservative um, group. And largely it was motivated by partly the cost of incarceration in the adult system, because the focus really was on the adult system, I do believe. But I think we began to see some of those theories applying to the juvenile justice system. Are we really doing this right? Are we really getting for our investment in the system kind of the outcomes that we would like? So again, that's an example of how we kind of have this flow
Mm-hmm.
of thinking. I'm going to jump a little bit sideways and come back to something, but you talked about the recognition of kids, youth having access to the same tools that adults do. But you also, I think, touched on the idea that kids are different. And there has been more recently a embracing and a recognition of that difference. A lot of it has to do with neuroscience. Could you say just a little bit about that? I think we're going to circle back to that, but I think it's an important piece of how we're currently thinking about our system or the system.
Yeah, we have this kind of bright line distinction. In Ohio, the age of majority is 18. And so once you're 18, you're considered an adult. And there's then an assumption that once you're an adult, you have the same cognitive abilities as all adults
Mhm.
would have, for thinking and processing and impulse control. But what we've seen through the neuroscience advances is really that the brain continues developing until a person's mid-20s. And so what we see is kind of these hallmark features of youth, impulsiveness, susceptibility to peer pressure, inability to think through consequences before acting. Those, kind of signature qualities follow people past the age of 18.
Right.
And so, because the brain is still maturing into the mid-20s, there's, a kind of what we can expect in terms of behaviors for youth and even criminal offending, that young people will kind of ramp up into offending behaviors at a certain age, and then will just naturally stop offending
Mhm.
as their brain matures and they're able to think more clearly and weigh consequences and be able to just be a little bit more self-regulatory in how they
Mhm.
engage with the world. And so one of the things that we know is that because children are and even the late adolescents or young adults up to age 25 are still developing, they're really capable of remarkable change. And
Mhm.
what's happening with the brain at those last years of maturation is really critical. And so the more that we can expose them to positive experiences that will help them grow into adulthood successfully, the more likely it is that they're going to make better choices. And if they were engaging in,
Mhm.
offending when they were younger, that they'll just stop.
Yeah.
But because there's some really important things happening with brain, development during those years, when we expose kids to, environments that have maltreatment and that are traumatic and, expose kids to abuse or violence, it it stunts their ability to continue growing
Mhm.
successfully into adulthood and really be able to have all of the tools and resources they need to become successful adults.
Yeah, and those are the kinds of things that we obviously want for all kids, let alone kids who have um, often a set of vulnerabilities already playing out
Mhm.
in their lives. So I think that is um, an important feature. Can you talk a little bit about, so as the greater community has become a bit more familiar with the justice system for kids and for kids in general and youth development, can you talk maybe about some of the myths that we confront and some of the facts that maybe counterpoint some of those myths about what's actually happening in this world with these kids?
Yeah, I think just to give one quick example, Cleveland.com engaged in a larger, kind of investigative reporting series called Delinquent. And it really highlighted through the voice of young people who have gone through the system, as well as people who have been the victims and their families who've been involved with the juvenile justice system. It really showed that there are some common denominators that
Hmm.
both drive young people into the system, and then also some common denominators of what they've experienced going through that system. And so I think in some ways it it confronted some myths that exist that, these young people are irredeemable, or
Hmm.
they don't care about the fact that they're harming others, or they don't, they're not seeming to capitalize on opportunities that are provided to them. And so it really kind of broke down some of those myths and provided a different perspective on where we need to really work on improving if we care
Hmm.
about not only prevention, but really making communities safe for everyone.
Yeah.
And, so some of the kind of myths that we hear pretty frequently is that, juvenile court is really just kind of a slap on the wrist,
Mm.
that kids aren't receiving a real punishment or a real
Mm.
sanction. And because it's considered a slap on the wrist, kids are likely to continue to offend and engage in poor behavior, right? That the juvenile court has to be tough in order to change the trajectory of behavior for you. Uh, but really, the juvenile justice system, as kind of mentioned earlier, has some pretty harsh penalties and severe consequences that attach to young people.
Mhm.
And, things like being incarcerated, you're removed from your home, from your school. As a child, that can be incredibly scary and traumatic to be, removed from your community at a young age and placed in a locked and confined environment. Um, and that can last for several years. I mean, young people can be incarcerated for a great deal of time. There are also consequences that tangibly, that young people might have to go on a registry if they're accused
Mhm.
or adjudicated of a sexually related offense, and that can last well beyond their youth years. Um, so there are
Yeah.
serious and long-lasting consequences, but I think another myth is that related to that is that kids need a serious punishment in order to make that change in
Right.
behavior. And we know through decades of well-established research that that's not really how accountability for young people work, right? You hold youth accountable in ways that are shown to change their behavior, and a punishment isn't an effective way to change behavior with youth. It's behavior change is best supported by non-punitive ways where you're actually holding youth accountable by supporting them and helping provide them with the interventions and services they need.
Yeah.
So that's
Well,
that's one of the common myths that we hear.
yeah. And in researching for this topic and looking at some of the notes that you provided, I believe that you said that even within our own state language regarding juvenile justice, that those more contemporary philosophies are there.
Mhm.
The
Yeah.
idea of rehabilitation, the idea of accountability, juxtaposing that with, quote, punishment.
Mhm.
So we have, interestingly, in our own state laws that guide this system, some of those values. So,
Yeah, we do, the laws that govern adult court explicitly allow for punishment of the offender.
right.
And in our juvenile court laws, that word doesn't exist. And it recognizes that holding youth accountable looks very different than punishing an adult.
Mhm, mhm,
And holding youth accountable requires providing for their care and development so that they get
mhm,
what they need so they don't continue offending.
right.
And also providing sanctions that are appropriate and developmentally appropriate as well.
Mhm,
But it has to be proportional. We can't punish kids in the same way we would punish adults.
right.
It's not going to yield a different, a better outcome for their behavior. And ultimately that makes public safety, worse off. And so if the goal is to restore victims and ensure that we're keeping our community safe, we have to do what we know works versus what
Right.
might feel good as a reaction, because that's how we do it in the adult system. We have to constantly be grounded in the fact that our juvenile justice system is different and for a reason.
Right. And restorative justice feels like something that is more unique to the juvenile justice system um, than the adult system, which is not to say that there aren't adult systems and processes where people are really encouraging that kind of dynamic.
Mhm.
But I think in the juvenile justice system, it's much more explicit about that level of reform,
Mhm.
restoration,
Mhm.
you know, makes makes its presence known, I
Yeah.
guess,
Yeah.
in the justice system more.
Yeah.
So when we think about the myths, the realities, the fact that our state is currently looking at some pretty serious reform efforts. Oh, and by the way, I did want to mention that the series of articles that you mentioned in cleveland.com, we'll post that link on this page, and people will have a chance. I think it was many, many, many articles
Yeah.
over several months, which I believe the editor of the paper said was fairly unprecedented
Mhm.
as a deep dive, which I think is very indicative of the worthiness of this topic.
Yeah.
Um, but I wanted to kind of bring it to the issue of reform and what kinds of, and you can speak about this either from a national perspective or a state perspective or whatever your experience um, affords you, but what are some of the reform points that seem to be unfolding? Maybe not necessarily wholesale, but
Mhm.
are garnering some attention. People are beginning to look differently at how we did it this way. Now we're going to think about doing it this way.
I think one of the trends that's emerging is really understanding kind of the root causes or contributing causes of what drives young people into the juvenile justice system. So thinking through reform that's more focused on prevention. And I think, for example, the Cleveland.com series did a good job of really highlighting, and I don't think intentionally this is what came out of their reporting, is that um, young people consistently who were engaged in the juvenile justice system and at the deepest ends
Yeah.
were, they lacked positive adult role models. They had very destabilizing home environments. They were witnessing and experiencing abuse and neglect and violence in their communities and in their homes. And they then were manifesting symptoms of a lot of trauma that went unaddressed. And so they felt, they were protecting themselves in a community that wasn't protecting them. And I think when we think about reforms, some of the most effective measures that are emerging are really trying to address some of those common denominators. So linking youth with community-based supports that are going to prevent them from engaging with the juvenile justice system, or if they're already engaged, preventing them from continuing to engage with that system. So we see things like, instead of responding with incarceration or responding with, well, removing that child from their community, it's thinking through how do we provide support services in the community as the juvenile courts response. So a reform measure, that we see emerging is, linking kids with a role model through mentoring programs. We're hearing a lot emerge nationally about credible messenger programs. So for young people who are engaged with the system, they can then be matched with a mentor who has been through that system themselves and has made a transformation in their life, and they can really connect with that young person and foster their change from their firsthand experience, and that they become more credible in terms of helping to guide a young person. So there's some community-based reforms that we're seeing happen that really try to address some of those common denominators. But I think on a system level, we're still very much invested in the structures that exist. And those structures include, youth prisons and detention facilities and probation services and kind of a myriad of what we think of as traditional juvenile justice system interventions. And so given that we have these structures in place, there seem to be some conversations with reform about how do we make those systems more effective in how they're working with youth. Because if this is the system we have, but we're seeing that the output of those systems isn't providing us with A, they cost a lot of money, and B, we're not getting our return on that investment by seeing positive outcomes for youth. So how can we shift what those systems are doing so that they can be more effective, safer, and more rehabilitative for young people?
Right. And part of that reform feels like and that reform acknowledges the role, the impact, the accountability, I would suggest, in my own opinion, the responsibility of other public systems to be collaborative. We hear a lot about let's knock down the silos between and among the systems that serve kids, especially this nucleus of young people who have engagement at deeper levels in child welfare, juvenile justice, behavioral health. And I think what's important for people to understand is that there is evidence that that approach can be successful. We're gonna toot our own horn here a little bit with talking just a little bit about the Behavioral Health Juvenile Justice Initiative, often referred to as BHJJ. And this is a state-funded from the Department of Youth Services project that is managed. The research is managed by the Begun Center. And what it does is looks at the communities that received grants who have successfully diverted youth from deeper end engagement in the system and have successfully diverted them back to or stabilized in their homes, their communities, their schools. And again, we'll put a link to that research up on this webpage. And even though there is a 200-page report that Dr. Crutchmeyer is rightfully proud of, there's also a one-page infographic that I think really captures how significant being strategic about where to put resources and what resources. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about best practices and what's emerging in the field, or what we see people kind of moving towards because the results seem to be there.
Yeah, I mean, I think BHJJ is a great example of that. It costs a minute fraction of what it would cost to incarcerate a child to serve them in their home community. And the outcomes are incredible. I mean, the success rates are phenomenal. So, we see that in other areas that focus on community and family-centered services. So
Hmm.
models like multi-systemic therapy, functional family therapy, things that are really tailored to engaging the young person where they're at in their community with their family involved
Right.
and providing skills and interventions for that whole family unit that is going to be much more successful in maintaining that child in their community safely than
Right.
removing that child, incarcerating them, and exposing them to harsher, conditions
Right.
without repairing the damage that might have occurred in that family to begin with. That child is going to return home. And so the best practice is we have to make sure that that home and that community not only welcomes that child, but is supporting that child. And so the best way to do that is on the front end.
Yeah.
So those kind of wraparound services that really
Mhm.
focus on behavior change and supporting the family are, really the leader in terms of what we should be doing for young people.
Right.
Some of the other kind of notable best practices that we've seen, especially across the country, was, kind of a shift away from adultifying our young people.
Hmm.
So removing kids who had previously been placed in adult, jails and prisons, treating youth with kind of the specialty courts that recognize a young person who might have mental health or drug addiction, behavioral health needs,
Hmm.
and treating that child differently so that we address those underlying causes. So specialty courts have really emerged as another best practice. And rethinking kind of, even for example, status offending. I mean, that's a good example of engaging with the other systems as well. So youth who are would be considered truant or unruly, are really aren't doing well with listening to their parent or responding to what they need to just do, getting themselves to and from school. And instead of punishing those kids, we've kind of decriminalized those offenses. So instead of holding them in detention and punishing them, we are referring the family to community-based resources to really understand what is the root cause. How can we support you and your family getting your child to and from school? What are these barriers that you're experiencing so that we can prevent deeper, system involvement? So some of those linkages at the front end have, emerged. And I mean, we used to house youth who were truant or unruly
Hmm.
in detention
Hmm.
centers as a punishment. And we now know that didn't produce any better outcomes. So
Yes.
shifting the frame of thought.
Well, and I know that I'm reaching back a little bit into my memory cells here regarding research, but I think there's a pretty prominent and very robust research project out of Northwestern University on the juvenile justice system. And it's what I call the domino effect. And what they've done is they've followed up youth for many years. So not just 6 months later or a year later, but we're talking, maybe half a lifetime. And I think this is my synopsis, so I might have this a little bit wrong, but I think it's largely accurate that even crossing that threshold, regardless of the severity of the infraction or what has brought this youth into formally the justice system, um, there is a cascade of bad outcomes.
Mhm.
Uh, and so that domino effect of if we can keep them from the front door or as far away as possible, we're certainly not assured, but we have a better chance of moving in a positive direction. And it's interesting to me that when you talk about those outcomes, staying at home, staying in school, being successful
Mhm.
in school, developing a positive peer relationship, enhancing family
Yeah.
relationships and communication, reduced engagement with other systems. Those are outcomes that child welfare, juvenile justice, behavioral
Mhm.
health all value.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a connection there. And I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about some of the systems relationships that occur or are present with many kids who are involved in the justice system and how that plays out. In fact, I think there is a term we talk about dual
Mhm.
involvement youth who are child welfare,
Yeah.
juvenile justice.
Yeah, there's I think a study that showed about 2/3 of Cuyahoga County's youth who ended up in the delinquency juvenile justice system had prior child welfare involvement. So they crossed over from the child welfare system into the juvenile justice system. And, really what that shows us is that the kids who ended up, 2/3 of the youth who ended up in the juvenile justice system locally experienced abuse or maltreatment prior to violating the law or engaging in misbehavior, right? And so really thinking about how do our systems work with young people to set them up for success or not, and where can we improve? I think one of the opportunities we have is really to think about, now that we have a lot of this research and data, and even, for example, some of the common denominators I mentioned that came out of the Cleveland.com series is we kind of have a roadmap of what these kids are lacking. And so it's important for us as the community and adults in these systems to really then build those supports up so that our young people are equally getting what they need to be successful in their communities. And that requires investments on the front end and not just reacting to the behavior after it's already happened. So some of the systems that, really need to communicate better or probably need some additional investments and funding to make sure that kids are safe and they have an inclusive and welcoming community and have areas where they can play and explore and be kids and make mistakes and not have those mistakes dictate how they're treated for the rest of their life. So that they can grow and change. And so one of the opportunities that I think is really exciting is Cuyahoga County's, the Cuyahoga County Council has formed an advisory subcommittee over juvenile justice to really examine how our local juvenile court is doing programming and what that connects to in terms of recidivism rates. They're helping to identify some of those best practices that can be incorporated into our local system and looking at a financial needs and resource assessment. And I do hope that because it's a county-based kind of advisory committee, that it will consider those other systems that are involved, whether it's the child welfare system, our school systems, our health system, public health systems, some of these other kind of areas where children are engaging and where they're failing in some of those areas and having some barriers. How can we support them on that front end so they don't become a person that shows up in the court system?
So as we kind of wind down, there's a couple of things I would like to hear some of your thoughts about. One is, from your perspective and experience, at the moment, what are some of the more enduring concerns? And these can be, big picture issues in our current iteration of juvenile justice that you as an attorney, you as an advocate, are concerned about.
One of the areas that I'm deeply concerned about is this kind of return to a call for tough on crime and increasing punishments for youth. One of the things that we saw as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic was, youth were kind of being moved out of facilities and being, held safely in their community pending their case, right? And so we saw some kind of really interesting practices being done and noted there wasn't, that didn't increase any issues with crime. I mean, the crime rates for young people and arrest rates for young people on the whole have been on a decline since the 1990s. There have been some increases in certain high-level offenses, but that is also on the decline. However, the kind of coverage that we're seeing in the media and some of the conversations that we're seeing from leaders in our communities and statewide are really taking a few of some of the isolated, really horrifying cases that have happened and making it sound like this is the norm rather than the exception. And what we know happened in the 1980s and 1990s with the super predator myth was the exact same pattern as taking a few highly publicized, isolated incidents that were really tragic, and making it sound like we have a larger problem than we do. The vast majority of young people who engage in offending behaviors move through the court system, don't reoffend, and move on. However, when we have failures where kids are repeating and where we haven't figured out the formula to intervene appropriately, that doesn't mean that we give up and that we treat them more harshly. It means that our system has some work to do, right? And so some of the concerns that I have is that we've started to incorporate some of what we know from science and research of what works, but we have a ways to go. And this concept that exists out there that we are somehow in a crime wave, or that young people are offending at higher rates than ever, which the data just doesn't support that to be true. But that's the perception, and it becomes the perception the more that those kind of talking points are used, and perception then can be used to call for tougher and more punitive responses to young people when we know that doesn't work. So I think one of the challenges we have is really protecting the progress that we've made in terms of doing what we know works for kids, but we have a ways to go. And the conversation around, harmful rhetoric and kind of fear-based rhetoric threatens to undermine the progress we've made and where we need to continue to go.
Yeah. Great points. Despite the advances that we've made and continue to make, there is no lack of a list on the other side of what we still need to focus on and address and advocate for, and put the science out there and put the results out there, put the lived experience out there, and really make sure that the picture is a full picture, is a fair picture. I want to know if you wanted to say anything about some of the concerns in the justice system regarding race and kids' involvement, kids of color particularly.
Yeah, there's no shortage of data points that we could rattle off about disproportionate minority contact. And, Ohio really is struggling to make progress on some of those really concerning and profound racial disparities that we see. As you look deeper into the system, those racial disparities just get worse and worse. So while Black youth make up a minority of our population, they're overrepresented at all phases in the juvenile justice system. And it's not it can't be accounted for by, self-reporting on offending behaviors. Black youth and white youth report engaging in the same behaviors at the same rates. It's really about over surveillance in certain areas and our system's response to certain behaviors. So we know that there's a bias that exists. Black boys starting at the age of 10 are perceived as 4.5 years older on average. They're more likely to be perceived as guilty, and they're more likely to face, police violence. So from that initial encounter, we have some, significant bias that sets in. And for Black girls, that starts at age 5. They're seen as less innocent and less in need of protection. And so the fact that, this bias exists and is out there, we really need to be aware of that and be working to reduce the racial disparities at every point in our system. Some youth, primarily our white youth, are given opportunities to learn and make mistakes and grow, whereas Black youth are treated more punitively for some of those same mistakes. And so whether that's, being punished through school and feeding into the, juvenile justice system, or in the community, what we see as the most profound kind of disparities is for youth who are treated as adults. So in Ohio, young people starting at the age of 14 can be transferred to adult court and treated as adults for punishment purposes if they're found guilty. And so it's known as a bind over. And our bind over rates in Ohio, it's about 80% each year. of bind over youth who are treated as adults or Black. And in Cuyahoga County, that number is anywhere between 90 to 98% each year.
Mm.
So there are choices that our system is making on who deserves the harshest punishments and who's perceived as behaving older and can be treated as adults. And that really requires some very intentional and strategic work to make sure that we are reducing disproportionate contact for minorities in our system, to ensure that, our Black youth are given the same opportunities that our white youth to make mistakes, learn, and grow.
Right. Would I be correct in assuming that part of the agenda for this subcommittee at the county level will be looking at that?
I think that should be part of the best practices examination is, really having a very tailored roadmap for reducing racial and ethnic disparities. And, the Annie E. Casey Foundation is kind of developed this gold standard in terms of, core strategies through what's called JDAI, the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. And really, Cuyahoga County subscribes to that model. So does Ohio. And so one of the tenets of JDAI is to have, reducing racial and ethnic disparities. And so, we didn't get here kind of by accident overnight. There were some very intentional things that happened in our system to place minority youth in a more compromising and vulnerable state. And so it's going to take some very intentional work to dismantle those, those kind of embedded policies and practices. And there's a very good opportunity. I mean, there's a lot of resources that exist out there nationally as roadmaps as well to help counties. Cuyahoga and Ohio are not outliers. This is something that counties across the country struggle with. And so there's a really good opportunity.
Very good. We're going to wrap up with this last question, and it's probably we probably won't have time to give it all that it deserves, and maybe we ought to even think about a part 2 podcast to take a deeper dive here. But we've talked a lot about reform and people taking more of a measured look at what's going on. And so we know that just last week or 2 weeks ago, the governor released the recommendations put forth by the working group on juvenile justice that was convened to look at where reform, where opportunity exists for improving and strengthening Ohio's juvenile justice system. Can you give, and there were 26 recommendations, and so clearly we're not going to be able to dive into all of them, but can you give a reflection perhaps of kind of when you set that report down, kind of what you think about and what you hope for that came out of that process? Because that would be my question. Yeah,
there's plenty to dig into with that report. I think, I think some of the big takeaways really acknowledge that that the current structures that exist for how we house and how we treat our youth with the highest needs at the state level, state youth prison level, are really not effective. And they are not going to be effective if we don't rethink them, and pretty dramatically. So, one of the, I think, hopes that I have for this recommendations is that we are able to take some bold steps to really reimagine how our prison system works for youth and how it needs to be transformed to be safer and actually provide what it's intended to provide, which is intensive rehabilitative services for youth who cannot be maintained safely in the community. So really shrinking the footprint of who is exposed to that kind of deep end punishment and what the environment that deep end punishment looks like, right? So housing youth differently and keeping youth out of that system who really don't need to be there. So, the hope is that there is a more investment on the community side to really keep young people who might be more vulnerable and young people who truly don't have kind of a safety need for incarceration purposes, to keep them out of that system.
Yeah.
And that requires, funding and investments, and some restructuring on our community side. But I think that's one of the big takeaways that I left with, is kind of a rethinking of how are we using our deep end system, and rethinking it in a way that is less draconian, and is more responsive to what we know about what works for young people and what doesn't, and shifting investments into what we know works better.
Yeah. And my familiarity, and I'm like everybody else, I've had a chance to read it. I haven't really had a chance to analyze it per se, but the sense of that we're talking not only about the physicalness of the system. So people have been using the term smaller than bigger, taking three large institutions and kind of morphing those out across the state to smaller, more community-based.
Yeah.
And that leads us to a great opportunity of a discussion regarding engagement with local community providers.
Absolutely.
Provide some of the services to youth while they are incarcerated. So there do seem to be some bright lights we can hope for as people begin to explore this. And it will be a longer process. I mean, these are not tomorrow, next year. Some might be, but many are going to unfold over time. Is there anything you want to conclude with regarding your thoughts regarding this conversation? Anything maybe we didn't cover that you want to put a pin in before we wrap up?
I just think one of the kind of guiding, principles that we should be keeping in mind, and sometimes often gets lost in the conversation, is that we know young people are capable of positive change, but that success for positive change is much more likely to happen if we're tailoring our interventions to an individual child's needs instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, right? And looking at the circumstances of that young person and really finding ways to ease the impact of the trauma they might have experienced and support them in, building a healthy way out of what they may have experienced and the behaviors they might be exhibiting. So I think sometimes that gets lost in kind of the shuffle of things. But I think we have some really exciting opportunities on the horizon in Ohio. And I hope that, it leads to some really positive change. And the hope, I think, also there is to start engaging in some more holistic and restorative models that also recognize the persons who have been harmed by, the behavior of young people, and including them in ways that look different than we have in the past.
Well, and the fact that part of these recommendations include an external objective set of eyes looking at our system, which is always a really helpful, it can be scary, but that's what it takes to kind of peel back some of the highlights and really get down to where could we really be making some strategic choices about how we work with kids and their families. So, well, thank you so very much for this conversation. I feel really fortunate. Feel really fortunate that you are a part of this changing process from a variety of perspectives. And again, I want to just thank you so much. And perhaps we'll have a follow-up conversation as some of these recommendations unfold and become clearer about what the path looks like, and begin to look at those from that perspective. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Patrick.
You're welcome.